So first in today's lineup, we're going to delve into behavioral economics, but specifically in the context for business. So behavioral economics as such, there's a lot of ha-hoo being done about it. However, I'm personally of the feeling that not many of us really get the nub of this subject, the nuances that matter, especially so in the context of business. So classical economics just says or assumes, wrongly so, I think, that we're all completely rational beings. But that is not so. Indeed, we are all emotional beings, and there's a lot of psychology involved in the way we think and decide, the decisions we take. So that's going to be the crux of today's story. And therefore, how can businesses leverage this knowledge? And therefore, what approach should they be ideally taking in understanding and implementing behavioral economics? And to anchor this, let me welcome the host for the first session of the day, Divya Kumar. Hi, Divya.
Hey Ganesh, good to
Hi.
meet you.
Am I audible, visible?
Very much.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us, Divya. It's a pleasure having you here.
Thank you.
Let me a few words about Divya before I hand it over to her. Divya's Group Digital CFO, IKEA Retail. She's a global executive and member of boards. Her work experience spans multiple countries, industries, and functions. She has led teams in the areas of business, finance, digital, technology, data, analytics, and strategy. That's a lot. She has spoken at events such as Women in Tech Europe and Future of Finance, and in conclaves conducted by Economic Times and NASSCOM. Not just that, so a little bit of what do I say? A peep into her life of work. She has published her daughter Kavya's series of books. They call the Fun Galore series of children's adventure books, and these have been published by her. And all those books have become bestsellers. So wow, you're bringing her up pretty much in the same line as you are, Divya.
Thanks so much, Ganesh. It's a pleasure.
So, welcome again. It's a pleasure to have you here. And over to you to take this conversation forward.
Thank you very much, Ganesh. And my achievements are nothing given the speaker here, who is Professor V Raghunathan. And very happy to have you here, Raghu. He spent 2 decades in IIM Calcutta, and after that went on to become I'm sorry, at IIM, and then went on to become, the president of ING Vicia, and then went on to GMR and has come back to academics and headed the Indian campus of the Schulich School of Business. So other than that, he loves to play chess. He has, his family seems to be doing, his wife seems to be doing wonderful things too in Bangalore and in the CSR space. So lovely to have you here, Professor. I hear you also love antique locks and love to play chess. So really, really happy for that. To hear that, because that's a very unique hobby to have. I think antique locks is something I have personally never heard of before, but would love to hear more offline on this one. But very warm welcome.
Thank you, Divya. Delighted to meet with you and to hear about the amazing things that you have been doing yourself, including your child. Just a small correction. I spent 20 years teaching at IIM Ahmedabad, not IIM Calcutta. I studied at IIM Calcutta, but I taught at IIM Ahmedabad. Yeah.
My apologies.
That's just a minor correction.
Right at the beginning.
Just for record.
Absolutely. No, thank you very much, Raghu. And, what a fabulous range of books you have, here. And you have written such an array of books all the way from, behavioral economics to the behavior of Indians, right? Games Indians play. And also, I also saw the queuing, which was very interesting. I haven't yet read it, but would love to. And Ganesha on the dashboard seems to be my favorite, right? So with that range, and then you also delved into mythology a little bit, with Duryodhana and taking a very different take on it. So with this vast array of books, where does your heart really lie? You seem to have so many passions, so many interests. So, tell us, what is the red thread that binds all of these, and also what you really feel passionate about?
Well, I always say I have a whole lot of complaints about what India is. But one thing I don't complain about is its range of keeping you interested. There's not a moment to get bored. So the more you look around, the more you see around, the more you experience your life living in India, which was a very conscious decision for me right from the beginning. I think there is so much to live for and absorb and talk about and agonize over, anguish outpourings, cathartic processes. So my books in many ways represent a range of those. So yeah, Games Indians Play was my first one in the popular genre. After I finished my academic career, I took, it took 4 or 5 years gap before I started writing majorly again. But these were all the popular books. The earlier ones were all finance oriented books. I started with Games Indians Play, which was a cathartic process, looking at our own some of the ugly aspects which we could do with reflecting about and so on. So that's where I started. Then, because I was also in the foundation, now looking at very different kind of children, I talked about don't sprint the marathon. Parents pushing their children to top in everything from tennis class to swimming to class test to the final exam. They were making the child run a whole marathon as if it was a series of 100-meter sprints, which doesn't work. You fall by the wayside. So that was the other book. I wrote a book on paradoxes and dilemmas. I called it Corruption Conundrum as a quote hanger of a particular chapter, but it was about paradoxes in all aspects of our lives. Then I wrote another one about Ganesh on the Dashboard, which was about lack of scientific temper in India, where you look for a good day and you look for Rao Kalam to take delivery of your car, then you go to a Balaji temple to have it all blessed and so on, then stick a plastic Ganesha for good measure for safety, and then drive without seat belts, which is what 80% of Indians do. So that was Ganesha on the Dashboard. Then I wrote books like don't Beyond the Call of Duty, which was about very very young Englishmen who came to India. And I'm not talking about the rulers, the Lord Macaulays and those kinds. These are 17, 18-year-old youngsters who came to India and did some amazing things which we don't know much about. So it was a stories of those. I wrote about Locke's Mahabharata and mathematics because I collect Locke's and I have enough mathematical background being a finance professional. And I know as much Mahabharata as most lay people living in India do. So I wrote these stories from Mahabharata and wove them through similarities of some of the Locks which I have in my collection, then the similarities of both with certain mathematical principles. And in the process, I had done some excess reading on Mahabharata, and I used it up to write Duryodhana, talking about his take on why should he be singled out as a dark villain in the entire epic of Mahabharata, and that he was no better or no worse than the Pandavas, given that he had his own Rajadharma to follow, and so playing a sort of a Ram Jethmalani to Duryodhana. So I wrote that book. Returned to Jammu because I was born and brought up partially in Jammu, apart from Punjab and Haryana. So I just took the backdrop of my childhood and wrote a fiction, which was one of my first attempts at fiction. In between, I wrote that a good Indian's guide to queue jumping, which of course stares at you every time you're at the airport, for instance. You're trying to put your bag into the X-ray and somebody comes and puts a bag ahead of you. So if you're going to be queue jumping anyway, here is all the theory and here is all the research that has been done worldwide on jumping queues. So do it smartly. So that was one. And then, of course, my latest one is Irrationally Rational, which is the 10 Nobel laureates script the story of behavioral economics. So as you can see, also getting too attached to any one field is too constricting and restrictive in your imaginative processes. So I just made sure that other than two of my books, which is Games Indians Play and Queue Jumping, the rest of the books are all in very, very different genre. And it's been fun.
That's really lovely. And as you say, there is no dearth of stories in India, right? Or
Yeah.
of topics to write about when it comes to
Correct.
that. Coming to your latest book, you have spent so long in academics and then went to corporate, came back to academics. That is very rare. For example, I've lived in, corporates all my life. I'm sure a lot of people have lived in academics all their life. It's very rare to find people straddling both these so successfully. How has that influenced this book that you have written and the ideas behind it and the stories behind it? Because I find that a novel part of your journey that, has really reflected in the book.
Yes, you see, as long as one was in higher academia, one had very little time to flirt with the popular writing. Because what would add to your CV value in those days was all academic papers and academic books and so forth. And that's what I was doing. I used to be on the boards and so on, but then that's not really, getting your hands dirty in the corporate sector. So that's how, when an opportunity to head the ING Vaishya Bank came along, I took it because, as I like to say, I didn't want to die teaching. So my next 18, 19 years were in the industry, in the bank, heading the foundation. I was also MD of GMR Industries, where I was trying to check out the potential for ethanol as an alternative fuel and so forth. Uh, and then, of course, because through GMR, I was also involved in bringing Schulich to India, as a business school. So I took over there as a director. And I was also an adjunct professor in Toronto itself, which I continue even today. But I don't really, it's strictly not really back to academics full time. I'm an adjunct professor. I do some lectures and so on, but I don't do full courses anymore because I've done that for 25, 26 years. Also 25, 26 years, I used to go to SDA Bocconi in Milan, teaching behavioral economics every year. So I am done with full-time teaching in terms of teaching a full course. But yes, and now what happens is the last 18 years of experiences have been accumulating, and I've been writing books for the last 12 years in the popular genre. And as a matter of fact, the experiences of the last the corporate segment is far richer than the experiences during the academic segment, because the academic experiences were more academic, whereas the range of what I've been able to see, observe, and so on has happened more and more in the last 2 decades than in the first 2 decades of my career. So yes, in that sense, in terms of my writing today, I think it's my last 20 years which is coming in to kick in more than my first 20 years did.
That is really interesting. So I was trained as an economist about 20 years back, but when I did the behavioral economics course by Aireli, the Duke University about 10 years back, it blew me away. Right. Suddenly I was like, has everything I have learned really, it got shaken a little bit. Now, in the last 10 years, I find there have been so many books that have been written in a very conversational manner, so that they become a household names, like it could be Blink, or Outliers, or even a Thinking Fast and Slow. That some of the concepts, like for example, it could be confirmation bias, action bias, all those have become household kind of terms which were not there earlier. But are there some hidden gems, right? So there are some concepts that probably we are not, that how, I mean, normally we are not very familiar with, but actually drive our day to day behavior. Because as I did those courses, I really saw myself in all of them, right? And with your vast knowledge of behavioral economics, would be lovely if you could throw some light on some of those things which are less well known, right? Which influence us day to day.
Well, if one seriously gets into answering your question, there is hell of a lot. But obviously, in this kind of a restricted time, I can only think of a few quickly, top of my mind. One is, for instance, what is called the overestimation bias. Okay. All of us in private lives, in public life, in corporate lives, in any kind of a situation, we tend to overestimate our abilities. You think of building a house, you think of a certain budget, you end up spending double of that. You think you'll finish constructing your house in 2 years, it takes double that time. And it's the same thing if you're thinking about building a dam somewhere. It's not just about your house, which means the same overestimation bias or overconfidence bias is so prevalent, and yet we don't make an adjustment to it. And that is a surprising part. Knowing that we all overestimate and we suffer from this bias, for instance, it's shown that the reliability of knowledge itself, when you say I'm 90% sure, you are actually only 70% sure. Okay. So we do tend to overestimate our own knowledge. Take driving ability. Now, given that, if you ask 100 people, are you a very good driver, an average driver, or a poor driver, you will expect that on an average, everybody is an average driver, because by definition, average is in the middle. But about 80% people end up calling themselves better than average. So obviously, there's an overestimation bias there. And knowing the overestimation bias, we don't correct it. Now, that is one which always surprises me. The other is anchoring. We never realize, if you go to an interview and they say, okay, what is the salary that you are expecting? 9 out of 10 people will say, sir, what is it that you plan to offer? We put the ball back in their court. Or you are a tenant going to a landlord for a meeting, and each one tells the other to quote what is the rental that you are willing to pay or you are willing to demand. We don't want to be the first to tell them what is the rent that I am willing to pay, and nor is the landlord willing to say that this is the rent that I expect, which is very surprising, because there is more than enough evidence to say that the person who initiates has an advantage. If I ask, for instance, for a very high rental, the other person cannot bring it ridiculously to a lower level. So normally the person who demands more ends up getting more. By the same token, in a job interview, if I am the first person as a candidate, if I am supposing my actual worth is 50 lakhs, but I say I'm looking for 90 lakhs, chances are you'll end up at 65 lakhs. Okay. So the person who asks higher ends up getting higher. And we do not always realize this, and we keep putting, instead of taking the initiative, we try to pass on the initiative to the other one. So and there is research enough to show, for instance, two groups of people are asked a random, very random question: how many countries are there in the continent of Africa? But before they answer, one group is asked to, just use a turntable of a gambling table, and the number that appears is, let us say, 37. In another table, they do the same random roulette, and the number that appears is 68. And then you ask them how many countries are there in the continent of Africa. The numbers will be closer to 37 in the first case and closer to 68 in the second case. A completely random anchor tends to bias the final call. Okay. And this is something which most of us completely ignore in our day-to-day lives, for instance. I could go on, but I suppose this is enough. If you want more examples, I can give you some more.
Yeah, no, this is fantastic. It also shows how fickle our mind is, right? I mean, we are getting, I would say, played at all times, right? And we don't realize that we're getting played at all
Right.
times, right? And I think that's the wonderful thing also about your book, because I mean, I think also reading a lot more and learning a lot more about behavioral economics also changes the way you operate on a daily basis. And
Absolutely.
I think that's the amazing part of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You actually, in fact, call yourself somewhere towards the end of the book an early behavioralist, right? And you say, as early as 1981. I mean, I would love to hear a little more about that, because I mean, we all think, when we are younger, especially, I mean, I remember myself at the age of 20, I thought I was invincible. I knew everything when I knew nothing, right? And I think we all go through those phases, but I don't think any of us ever think of ourselves as a behavioralist. And it's very interesting to hear you use the term. So, what made you think that, and what sparked your interest in this topic?
Well, when I did my doctoral dissertation in 1979-81 about that phase, I'm ancient, incidentally, which is apparent. So, when I was doing this dissertation, I didn't even know that something called behavioral economics. Though the early works of Kahneman and Tversky, etc., was just about beginning. But I had not read those works because those days libraries were not so interconnected. The only access I had was to IIM Calcutta Library, which would always lag behind 2 years or so in terms of latest journals. But I was doing some work on the cost of capital. Okay. And the Modigliani Miller's famous theory that debt is irrelevant to valuation of a firm was a central mark of efficient market hypothesis, and so on. But I had a different feel. I thought that, look, intuitively we say so and so is when you look at borrowing, you always attach a negative connotation to borrowing, debt ridden, and someone who bankruptcy and things like those. So negative words are very frequently associated with it. If there is so much of negativity associated in our minds that he's a perennial borrower and he will die in debt and so forth, if there is so much negativity, then how would the market be indifferent between a company which is debt free and a company which is debt laden? So that was the thought in my mind. And I said, therefore, to say that if a company, two identical companies, if one borrows a lot, the other only manages with equity, and supposing initially for some reason their valuation become different, the usual model was that arbitrage will drive the values to be equal. And my point was, arbitrage may reduce the difference, but cannot do away with this mindset that we have, which is against debt fundamentally. So I basically interviewed some brokers and so on and tried to show that the bias exists. So even after the arbitrage process is complete, the two firms cannot have the same value. There will be a reduction in the gap in the value. Now, I didn't know that I had done anything in behavioral economics or something, except that one of the examiners who was from IIT Madras said this was the most original thesis that he had seen in a very long time since Modigliani and Miller. But I was completely ripped apart when I gave my faculty talk at IIM Ahmedabad as a 26-year-old applying for a position of an assistant professor, because nobody would buy the argument that you could say something which was not in alignment with Modigliani and Miller. Okay, it's a different matter that fortunately my seminar went well and I got an offer from IIM Ahmedabad and I spent my next 20 years there. It is only now when I started understanding behavioral economics in all its depth and width that I realized, oh my God, I was an early behavioralist myself. Except nobody ever heralded me as one. I didn't know myself until very recently when I tried to reflect on it.
No, that's really nice. When I read your book, there was one statement that really struck with me, and it said something like, "We have our warts." I think warts, moles, and pimples was the exact words you used, and I loved it. Somehow, it immediately stuck with me, and it was somewhere in the beginning of your book, so it immediately sparked my interest and said, "Okay, I do need to read more." We all come with so many flaws, right? I mean, it's a part of us. It's human. I mean, how do you, when you said that, what was in your mind? And also, how do we really then overcome them, right? And also, really look at the world with new eyes? And also, how does awareness of ourselves really help in how we deal with it? Could be business or personal life.
Right. You see, many of the when I use warts, moles, and pimples, I use them at two different levels. Okay, at one level, I say that according to the neoclassical economists, people all behave beautifully in a uniform manner with great uniform complexion, all smooth and shiny face. In reality, it's not that smooth. There are biases, there are heuristics, there are emotions which do put speed bumps on your decision making. So decision making is not uniform in that sense. It is impacted by your biases, heuristics, and emotions, and so forth. And I've called them warts, moles, and pimples at one level. At another level, I talk about warts, moles, and pimples in another book, like Games Indians Play, where I say our ugly view as our ugly side. If you spit wherever you want, if you throw your garbage anywhere you want, you jump the queue at leisure, it's what moles and pimples in our personality. But here I'm talking more in the first sense in this book, and whether it is a business decision maker, we are talking about economic decision making. Whether it is a business manager taking an economic decision for a firm or an individual taking an economic decision for oneself, the fact is we are trying to maximize utility for ourselves. Except that when it comes to corporates, the objectives of the corporates and the objectives of the managers may or may not be aligned. In fact, the manager wants to take a decision which will bring him a greater pay package, greater glory, bigger revenue, and a bigger market to control over, which may or may not maximize the profit. Okay. So now this gap itself is a what or a mole in behavioral sense of the word. Okay. So in this book, when I say what, moles, and so on, I'm talking about these folds and layers which prevent the neoclassical economists' predicted behavior from being realized on the ground. So that's what I've really meant there.
I want to pick up one thing that you mentioned just now, which was around the manager versus, I mean, the principal agent, in other words, right? That you're talking about. Now, the principal agent, this dilemma has been there for, forever, right? But I mean, while there have been things put around it, people have tried to put controls, people have tried to do different things. It has never got resolved. Do you have any light to throw about, I mean, what do you feel about this dilemma? And is this really something that we see, I mean, ever resolving? Or is it something because of human behavior, it will just go around in a circle? The more controls you keep, there will be a loop that will, continue to.
This is where transaction economics comes in. The work of Williamson, which is there in my book, along with Oliver Ostrom and Williamson. Williamson has done a lot of work on transaction cost economics, where the cost of the principal agency conflict is measured. Okay. And then it again goes to show exactly what you are talking about, that in the neoclassical economics, it's all perfect. The transaction costs are minimal, they are nearly zero and all that. And even in the stock market, you say the cost of transaction is virtually negligible, and therefore the arbitrage will happen beautifully. But in reality, that is not so. There are a whole lot of things that kick in. For instance, you have this endowment effect, because of which you may not sell the shares that you have received in endowment, for example. And therefore, arbitrage will not happen because you will not carry out the transactions. Similarly, the principal agency conflict, yes, if there is a huge principal agency conflict, you put some members on the board. Different parties. It may be banks, it may be insurance companies which have invested in the company, or stockholders. If there are minority shareholders, they put some representative, and you expect that you will try and control the behavior of the manager from venturing too far away from what is good for the business as a whole, for instance. And that is where good governance comes in. And that is where you talk about today half a dozen different kinds of governance committees in a good board. So ultimately, yes, greed in the human beings will always try to find out those loopholes to and expand on the principal agency conflict. And just for people to understand what is meant by principal agency conflict, it's very simple. If you are the owner of your own business, you may want to fly economy, you may want to stay in a 4-star hotel, and you may take an ordinary Uber cab or whatever. But supposing tomorrow a venture capitalist comes and puts in 60% of the money into your business, or a bank has lent you 60% of the money in the business, suddenly your carpet becomes thicker, your secretary is speaking far better English because you are paying 3 times the market rate, and suddenly your office is plush, and you're flying business class and staying at Taj, and all of that. So this change in behavior, which adds to the cost of transactions, is called the principal agency conflict. Principal is the owner, agency is the manager, and their interests are not aligned, and therefore there is a cost added. I just thought I should explain that, because though there may be non-finance people who are listening to us. So in this context, you are very right. It's like a spy versus spy game that we used to see in those old comics. You are trying to put greater controls to minimize the principal agency conflict, but then people are working overtime in their minds to find a loophole and expand that. So I think it's an equilibrium that you achieve between the two, and then factor that in as a cost in any case.
No, thank you. You mentioned the endowment effect. So one thing that I was hearing, about even before I joined IKEA is the IKEA effect, right? Which is really because you're assembling the furniture yourself, you attach a higher value to that furniture than you would otherwise. And that's so true, right? How much ever effort we spend into something, that is more
Yes,
precious to us than
absolutely.
when you just buy something off the shelf.
That's a
So
beautiful example. Yeah, that's right. Because you have literally put more skin in the game.
absolutely. We're almost out of time, but there was one last question I wanted to ask you. Is there any bias that you found perplexing, right? Because I mean, most of these are very relevant, very this thing, but is there anything that is unique and perplexing that you have found that, you would really like to share?
Yeah, I would. Though you thought it is a common bias, which is confirmation bias, I do find it perplexing because confirmation bias is the tendency to process information by looking for or interpreting information which is consistent with one's pre-existing beliefs. The bias can often lead one to uh, gather arguments, experiences which confirm and reconfirm what they already believe in and reject and rebuff what they do not believe in. And this happens, the more knowledgeable a person, the more the confirmation bias. You may believe in a certain political belief or a religious belief or whatever belief it is. I could come and show you a lot of facts, figures, proofs, and so on, and yet you are not willing to move from your position or pick up those nuggets which reinforce your original view. And this happens with the most erudite people, with the most well-read people. In fact, I remember recently, I had written an article saying uh, exclusion of Nehru from a state-sponsored ad among freedom fighters and patriots was not a right thing to do going by history. And I was sharing it with quite a few friends, and one of them, very erudite person, very widely read, responded by quoting Will Durant, okay, saying that history is mostly guesswork and the rest of it is meaningless or some such thing. Now, my point is all that extra scholarship, all that extra reading still goes into confirmation bias. You have read so well that you are able to pick and choose a proverb here, a quote there, or whatever to reinforce your case. Not to look at, after all, Nehru's history is not a 500-year-old history that it's all guesswork. It's all there in written records and so forth. So, to me, this confirmation bias, even among the very widely educated people, is always very perplexing. And I always find it very interesting and strange. And I try, at least I try. I mean, I probably am not, I don't consider myself a great scholar, but I do try to consciously move away from there, not have that confirmation bias. Well, otherwise, no debate can ever be that. That's why they say debates never result in any kind of a conclusion where you change somebody's mind in the other's side. It never happens. We see it all
It
the
comes
time. Everybody yells and then parts. So we might as well not have debates because
it
of
comes
confirmation
back
bias.
to we're not rational, right? So
Yeah, because it's excessive confirmation bias.
correct.
It's very deeply
Absolutely.
ingrained. Even when you know about confirmation bias, you can't get away from it easily. That is the beauty of all the biases. It's not as if just because you know about these biases, you'll find it easy to avoid them. And that is why it is a part of a discipline to study. It's not a quirk here or there. It is very consistent, very persistent bias observed in all our behaviors.
And actually, you don't escape them, but at least you're able to laugh at yourself. At least I am
At
sometimes.
least, yes,
That's just
absolutely,
okay. I
exactly.
fell into the trap. Is the
And you
thought
know
that
you're not
goes.
alone.
So it is. No, and you spoke about history. It's interesting. But when I read history, I sometimes find history has confirmation bias also, right? And
Yeah,
it has a lot of biases because
of
history is
course.
not just written by the
Correct,
victor, but it's also written depending on who writes it, right?
correct,
It's actually
correct.
anchored in a certain manner. So,
Right, absolutely. No. That is very true, and that is what probably Will Durant's statement is all about. Where he says most of the history is guesswork, and the rest is prejudice. That is the exact quote. The
prejudice,
rest is
correct.
prejudice, and we do see that bias in the history all the time. But that doesn't mean that 70-year-old history can be put into the dustbin because they're all available records. It's not what Aurangzeb might have said to Shah Jahan It's something what happened very recently in our lifetimes, more or less.
Very
I was
true.
alive when Nehru was alive.
Very true. No, and also
He
what you
might have been
speak
a
about
child.
confirmation bias, I wonder whether it's also linked to some of the things that you describe in Ganesha on the dashboard, right? Where we know of different things. So if you link these two together, it's actually, you get, you get a different view of what we do, right?
Absolutely,
In
absolutely. In a
in our
way, what you're
superstitious
saying is,
beliefs.
yes, you say scientific temper is about logical thinking, something which you hypothesize and then test out and then observe. So it's more like the system two thinking that you referred to earlier. Okay. But our normal day to day behavior comes more from system one thinking. And as a matter of fact, what you are just mentioning is what that think fast and think slow all about, you know. So
This
yes,
is
I mean there is a very close connection, and one can really relate one to the other.
since a
I
lot
mean,
of
we
people
know
here
we are not being scientific. If you had a friend who acted like God, who suddenly killed a 6-month-old somewhere and burnt a woman somewhere and had someone raped somewhere else and so on, you won't talk to that guy. You'll think he's the vilest person around. And yet, when it is a God, we keep going back, you know. And yet, we say all the bad that happens is God given. You know, we accept it. So it's a very funny kind of a dichotomy that we live with. And no, is it scientific? Maybe not. Is it part of our innate belief? Maybe yes. So, and there is that dichotomy. Yeah.
But just to describe to the people here, since not everybody may be familiar, if you could just give a short explanation of system one and system two that you mentioned, I think would be
Right.
fantastic.
Right. System one thinking essentially means what we intuitively quickly believe. You know, if everybody is running in a certain direction, you tend to run in that direction and ask questions later. Okay, because chances are that there is some fire somewhere, or some wild animals chasing them, or whatever it may be, or a police running with a baton behind them, and anybody could get hurt. So you tend to take that is your innate first response. But supposing you have some more background about the information, or you say, wait a minute, something seems wrong. No, I don't think this could be the right reason why people are running. So let me find out the reason and then decide whether it's worth running or not worth running. And you may get killed in the process, but sometimes you may be right also. But more often in normal day to day life, a little more deliberate thinking keeps you a little safer, though it takes more time to arrive at. Okay. I'll just give one example. For example, supposing we say that the male female ratio is roughly 50-50 in a society, and we are taking a count every month. Now, in the first 15 days, if you find more girls have been born than boys, 65% were girls, only 35% were boys born in the first 15 days of the count that you take. Then you intuitively tend to think that in the remaining 15 days, the gap will be made right. That there'll be more boys born than more girls born, so that overall the range will be 50-50. But in reality, any birth is independent of anything that happened in the past. So system two will make you realize that, and you will know. And it's the same thing in stock market. If prices have been falling repeatedly, you tend to take a pessimistic view or a bearish view, and you sell because you believe that because it has been falling, it will continue to fall. But those movements are not related to each other. The first is system one thinking, the second is system two thinking. So that's the example.
With the way the markets have been moving last 2 years, I mean, you're very right. So,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
anyway, but
Yes.
lovely to talk to you today, Raghu, and hope to keep the conversation going offline. I hope all of
Yes.
you who are on this session truly loved, hearing him. So, and please do read his book
Thank
if
you.
you're
Thank you,
interested
Divya.
more.
It's been
So, take care.
charming talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. That was a wonderful conversation. But before you both go, I have one question from the audience for Raghu. I'll just ask you that. Amisha is asking, what are some of your favorite books, Raghu?
Oh,
Please suggest some books that you love, is how she's put it.
fiction or non-fiction?
I then suggest keep it in the professional realm.
Well,
in the
I've been reading a
business book.
whole. You see, if you read Noise, which is one of the more recent books, you'll find it enchanting. It's a book which is something that you should be in your top 100 books, the bucket list kind of a book, for instance, among nonfiction.
Okay.
Among fiction, read Murakami. Right now, I'm heavily into 1Q84, and boy, am I having a great time.
I
So, right now,
see.
let me leave it with two books.
Lovely, thanks. I read Murakami's book on running. You know what you think when you think of running.
Oh,
So
that's an amazing book.
yes,
Read Norwegian Wood. It's a classic again,
I
but
see.
1Q84 is something else. I highly
Okay.
recommend it if you have any interest in uh, light literary fiction. It's not a heavy literary fiction.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's not like Albert Camus kind of a thing.
I think he expresses deep thoughts, but he's grounded enough. He does so in a grounded enough way.
Very grounded and definitely a future Nobel laureate. We can bet on it.
All right. Thank you so much, both of you. Thanks, Divya, for anchoring this so beautifully.
So beautifully.
Yes,
Thank you.
very, very interesting questions, probing questions. And Raghu, the less I don't have to say anything much about you. And I think for me, the biggest takeaways from your conversation were how you could manage to straddle, like Divya asked a very pointed question about straddling academia and then coming to the corporate world. And now you're going back to academia. I think you've had your legs in two or three boats. You've sailed in three boats for much of your career, I think,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that's something that for all of us can get inspired by. The other thing is also the whole conversation about biases. I think makes me think, go deeper, introspect a lot, and wonder why we do what we do, why we think what we think. And there are so many layers to unpack here, and that just doesn't come through in a moment. It doesn't.
Correct. It doesn't.
So thanks for shining
That's
some
why
light
you
on
talk
that.
about system one, system two thinking, precisely for that
Right,
reason.
right, right. So thanks for
And just
shining
like
light
a
on that.
human being.
And on that note,
Thanks a lot.
I will thank both of
Thank
you.
you very
Thank you,
much.
Divya. Thank you, Ganesh.
Thank
Thanks
you,
a lot.
Raghu. Thank you, Ganesh. Bye.
Bye bye. Have a great
Bye.
day. Bye.
You too.